Warning: viewer discretion is advised. Hi friends, welcome to Meals To Unalive For, where we talk about a true crime case and I make a meal from scratch. I'm your host, Jody Breton, and if you enjoy this episode, please like and subscribe. I'm here for you every Tuesday. To be honest, I've been putting off this case for a while because it's so heinous, and mainly because our serial killer that we're talking about today targeted specifically children. So, if you've been with me for a while, you know that that will get to me a lot easier than other cases. So, today we're going to be talking about Albert Fish. Albert was actually born Hamilton Fish on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to Randall and Ellen Fish. To say that the family had mental health problems would be an understatement. There was a very long history of mental illness. His uncle was diagnosed with mania, his brother was sent to a mental institution, his sister was diagnosed with mental affliction, his mother had visual hallucinations, and three other family members had other mental issues. Unfortunately, because it was in the 1800s, early 1900s, we of course don't know what actually afflicted them, if it was just a hormone imbalance. We obviously dealt with mental health very differently back then. Albert's father was a 75-year-old riverboat captain who would unfortunately pass away when Albert was 5. I think it's also worth mentioning that Albert's father and mother had over a 40-year age gap, so they were in completely different generations. And after his father passed away, his mother really didn't know what to do. She had a lot of mental health issues, as I said. And because she couldn't support the children, she put the children in an orphanage, including Albert. Now, during Albert's time in the St. John's Orphanage in Washington, he was very heavily abused. It was documented that the teachers would shred the children's clothes off, severely beat them, and whip them while other children watched. These experiences led Albert to become aroused from pain or causing pain to others, and he did attribute that he was like that because of his experience at the orphanage. He would also develop more concerning behaviors, like the habit of sticking needles into his groin for pleasure. Just as a side note, after he was executed, they took an x-ray of his body and you could see over 30 needles that were still in his body stuck there. In 1880, Albert's mother obtained a government job and she came to get him. At this time, he started frequently running away and he was still wetting the bed at age 11, which, as we know, is a big indicator for serial killers. At some point around this time, he had taken a pretty bad fall from a cherry tree, which caused a concussion. He had headaches, dizzy spells, and a severe stutter after the fall. So clearly, it caused some damage to his brain, which probably only accelerated the issues that he would begin to have later on. In 1882, Albert would meet a telegraph boy who would introduce him to urophagia and coprophagia, which, if you didn't know, is the eating or drinking of one's own excrement. So pretty disgusting. Albert starts displaying other concerning behaviors. For instance, he starts visiting public bathrooms to watch other boys undress for sexual gratification. When he turns 15, he graduated from a public school, and in order to start fresh and hopefully tone down bullying from his peers, he changed his name from Hamilton to Albert. Because remember, he was born Hamilton but went by Albert. Apparently, he really despised the nickname that bullies gave him, which was ham and eggs. And so he took on the name Albert because his younger brother had passed away who had that name. So he took on his younger brother's name, Albert. By 1890, Albert had arrived in New York City, and he said that he became a male prostitute and He said at first that it was consensual behaviors that he would exhibit, but then it moved on to non consensual. And he said this is where he began sexually assaulting young boys. And he kept committing them even after his mother arranged a marriage for him. In 1898, Albert would go on to marry Anna Mary Hoffman, and they would eventually have 6 children together. Throughout 1898, he worked as a house painter and said that he continued to molest children, mostly boys under 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum where Albert was fascinated by a bisection of a penis. Soon after, he developed a morbid interest in castration. During a relationship with a mentally handicapped man, Fish attempted to castrate him after tying him up. The man became frightened and fled, and Albert began intensifying his visits to brothels where he could be whipped and beaten more often. In 1903, he was arrested for embezzlement and was sentenced to incarceration in Sing Sing prison. And he said that he continued to have sex with men and, of course, cheat on his wife. It's around this time as well that there are reports of child molestations happening. So people are starting to be more suspicious of him. He wasn't charged for anything, but was definitely whispers going around the area. Soon after this, Albert would also discover that his wife was having an affair, and it is a pretty crazy story. Let me tell you about it. So apparently, Albert was very good at keeping track of their food, their money, their clothes, everything that they spent and where. So he noticed that there was a lot more meat going missing than normal. And when he asked Anna about it, she said that it was the dog that was eating more or stashing it away somewhere. And Albert had said that's very strange because it's a small dog. And one day the dog ran up to the attic, so he followed the dog up there. So Albert goes into the attic expecting to find a hoard of food, and he finds a man sleeping in his attic. And this would be Anna's lover, John Staub. He had been sneaking in and out of the house and just living there with her. According to Albert, he wasn't violent with John. He told him to come sit down at the kitchen table. They apparently had a conversation about it. But I guess this was the end for Anna personally because while Albert was out soon after, she sent the children to go watch a movie and she sold or took everything pretty much the family owned. So they had no money. Albert said that he tried to track down Anna and John and even followed them all the way to Connecticut, but unfortunately, everything had been stolen or sold at that point, so he was quite literally left with nothing and these 6 children. Albert did say that he saw John out in public one day. John was working on a house that was being built. When Albert saw him, he did try to chase him through the construction of the house, and he ended up almost falling off the second story. And John got away, but he did say that if he had caught John, he probably would have killed him. Albert also said that when Anna left, soon after, he really began to lose his grip on reality. He began to experience visual and auditory hallucinations, and his behavior became much more erratic. At this point, he was in his mid 50s and raising the children on his own and trying to put food on the table all at the same time while going through this mental crisis. So, due to all the stress and trauma that he was going through and mental illness, this is where he really starts getting into religion and he takes a deep dive into it. He believes that one of the only ways to cleanse himself of sin was through pain and human sacrifice. At one point, he began planning to sacrifice his own son, but he eventually abandoned this plan. He said that he was hearing voices in his head that were from angels or God, and that he believed that they were telling him that he had to torture others and himself to purge himself of his previous sins. He began to take Bible verses in scripture and added his own words that he was hearing in his head, creating really awful phrases that he believed he needed to live by. These phrases included sentences like, "Happy is he that taketh thy little one and dasheth their heads against the stones," and "Blessed is the man who correcteth his son," "In whom he delighteth with stripes, for great shall be rewarded." To Albert, the word stripes meant lashes from a whip. This quote was meant that the man who whips his son, who lashes his son, shall be blessed. And soon these delusions would become Albert's entire twisted reality. According to Albert, it's at this point that he began to sexually assault and torture young boys at an abhorrent rate. He believed that he was being told by God that he needed to beat the children, castrate them, and murder them. Unfortunately, because he had a job as a painter and traveled all over to do his job, he very easily found young boys and boys that were gullible enough to work for him, quote unquote. So it's unknown how many victims he really had. In 1919, Albert stabbed a mentally challenged boy around the Georgetown, Washington, D.C. area. Albert himself said that he typically targeted Black or mentally challenged children as he believed these young children wouldn't really be missed. Then on July 11th, 1924, he came across a family farm on Staten Island and noticed a young girl named Beatrice. She was playing out in the sunlight around the home, and he approached Beatrice and told her that he would give her some money if she came with him to help him find some rhubarb. Luckily, at the very last minute, Beatrice's mother came out and told Albert to leave the property. Later that night, Albert would return and try to sleep in the family barn, but the father found him and chased him off the property. Just a few days later, on July 15th, 1924, Albert would commit his first high-profile murder. Early in the day, an 8-year-old boy named Francis McDonald was sitting on his porch with his mother when they both noticed a lanky man with a gray mustache stumbling down the street talking to himself. At the time, neither of them really thought anything of it, and later that afternoon, Francis would go to the park with some friends, but he would never return. Reports came out saying that they had last seen Francis walking into the woods with an elderly gray-haired man with a mustache. A search party was quickly assembled, and later that night they discovered his body in the wooded area near the family's home. Francis had been sexually assaulted and then hung on a tree by his suspenders. At this time, though, nobody knew that it was Albert Fish who was the monster responsible for his death, and when Francis's mother spoke to the local newspaper, she described him as everything being gray. His mustache, his hair, everything about him seemed faded and gray, and this would earn him the nickname from the press called the Gray Man. On February 11th, 1927, Albert would strike again, but this time in Brooklyn. On that day, 3 young boys were playing in the hallway of their apartment complex. The boys were Billy Beaton, a 3-year-old who was with his 12-year-old brother, and Billy Gaffney, a 4-year-old neighbor of the brothers. At one point, the 12-year-old returned inside briefly. However, when he came back out, both the 3-year-old brother and the 4-year-old neighbor were gone. Billy Beaton was later found alive on the roof of the apartment complex, and when his older brother asked what had happened to Billy Gaffney, the 4-year-old his brother had been playing with, Billy responded by saying that the Boogeyman took him. On the same day, a man with gray hair and a gray mustache would be spotted on a trolley with a 4-year-old boy, and while the man wouldn't be identified for years later, Albert later admitted that yes, he was the one who had been seen on the trolley with Billy Gaffney that day. And sadly, they never found Billy Gaffney's body, and Albert describes in graphic detail what happened to him. Albert does go on to write confessions and letters about what he specifically does to his victims. Personally, I don't feel comfortable reading all of that aloud. I have a soft spot, especially for children, and I just don't think that I could do it. If you do want to listen to it, Murder in America has a really good podcast about him where they read everything and they're very tasteful about it. I just personally don't feel comfortable with that. On May 25th, 1928, Edward Budd put a classified ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." On May 28th, 1928, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan, New York, under the pretense of hiring Edward. He did introduce himself as Frank Howard, a farmer of Farmingdale, New York. When he arrived, Fish met Bud's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace. Fish promised to hire Bud and said that he would send for him in a few days. On his second visit, he agreed to hire Bud, then convinced the parents to let Grace accompany him to a birthday party that evening at his sister's home. But unfortunately, Grace would never come back. The police actually falsely accused and arrested a different man by the name of Charles Edward Pope on September 5th, 1930, as a suspect of the kidnapping. He was a 66-year-old apartment house superintendent and he was accused by his estranged wife. He did spend 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22nd, 1930. Unfortunately, the Bud case would go cold, and Fish starts moving between boarding houses in New York. He continues to assault minors, though they're not traced back to him. Albert also is, I think, getting lonely because he wants to find a wife, but he starts writing dozens of anonymous letters to women whose names he finds in the newspaper who are searching for a husband. But he writes some pretty despicable, raunchy things to these women. Albert was eventually arrested for sending one of these obscene letters, but nothing really came of it. And in 1930, according to him, he said that he married three separate women but divorced all of them shortly after the ceremony. So we don't really have the details on what happened with that, but he was trying to get another wife. Then in 1934, an anonymous letter to the Budd family home was sent to Mrs. Budd. And unfortunately, she was illiterate, so she couldn't read it for herself. She had her son read it to her. So I'll read you the gist of it and explain the necessities, but I won't go into detail. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand in the steamer Tacoma Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and two others went ashore, got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At this time, there was a famine in China. Meat was any kind from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep the others from starving. A young boy or girl under 14 was not safe. You can go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. Albert goes on to talk about how this friend, quote unquote, was now addicted to cannibalizing children, essentially because of his experience that he had in China, which I think we can assume is, quite a huge BS fest. But then he goes on to describe what happens later on when he visits them. On June 3rd, 1928, I called on you on 406 West 15th Street and brought you pot cheese and strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me, and I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I'd already picked out. We got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. The rest of the letter talks about how he strangled Grace and then cannibalizes her at the very end. Obviously, this would be a horrifying letter to read as a parent, and especially to have your child read aloud to you. But this would be Albert Fish's downfall. When the family brought it to the authorities, they noticed a small hexagon emblem on the envelope, and it read NYPCBA. The acronym stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, and this would be the first major lead in the case. When authorities visited this company headquarters asking questions, they came across a janitor who claimed that he had taken some of the envelopes home with him and he left it in his rented room at the boarding house where he checked out from the building. The police then headed to the boarding house and inquired what specific room, and that's when they first encountered the name Albert Fish. He had just checked out of the room a few days earlier and even asked the landlady if she could hold on to a check for him that he was expecting from his son in the mail. which was amazing news because that would mean that Albert was planning on returning to the building and they settled on preparing to make an arrest. When Albert returned, it seemed like he was going to come quietly, but as the two were leaving the building, Albert suddenly retrieved a razor blade from his pocket and threatened the detective. And after a violent scuffle, Albert was placed into handcuffs and hauled off to jail. When the police entered Albert's apartment, they found the Fish children living in horrible conditions. Apparently, the detective, William F. King, himself left the kids $1 to buy food upon seeing him because he felt so bad that they were in that condition. When the detective started his interrogation, he pretty much immediately confessed to the murder of Grace Budd, and he led detectives to the abandoned house where her bones were buried so they could put her at rest. And he started just talking about all the other crimes that he had committed. In fact, he would go on to sign 6 full confessions to his crimes, and his trial was an absolute horror show because he was not shy about what he did to all of these children. During his trial, both the prosecution and defense would go back and forth on whether they felt that Albert was insane or not. He had psychiatrists that were saying that he was, others saying that he wasn't. Certain ones were saying that just because he enjoyed certain activities like pedophilia, that, he wasn't insane. But after the 10-day trial, Albert was found guilty and sane and sentenced to death. Jurors would later state that they had no doubt that Albert was indeed insane, but they wanted him to be executed anyway, which honestly, I can't say I blame them. After about a year in prison on January 16th, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair. Allegedly, Albert stated that he was excited to be electrocuted and even told the prison guards that being electrocuted would be, quote, the supreme thrill. It was the only one I haven't tried. When he was positioned in the electric chair, Albert allegedly even helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. Albert's final statement before his execution was, quote, "I don't even know why I'm here." And that would be the end of Albert Fish. And in the eyes of the law, he only killed 3 children, but he claimed that he had murdered up to 100. At one point, he even boasted that he had murdered a child in every state of America. And sadly, because he seemed to target children from minority backgrounds, children with mental disabilities, and children who lived in poverty, kids who, according to Albert, wouldn't be missed. It's hard to know exactly how many kids he actually victimized, mutilated, and murdered. There's just no way to prove it, but considering he was so open about what he did to certain children, I would not be surprised. It didn't seem like he was much of a liar. So I'm honestly glad that he's gone. So for this meal, I decided to make chicken cutlets, homemade pasta, and then a deli salad and a New York cheesecake since we seem to be in New York for most of this story. So I kind of based it off of the region this time. And sometimes it's just because I want to cook something specific. So don't look too deep into like what I cook sometimes. Sometimes it's just a craving, other times it's the region. I also realized at the very end that I did not record when I pulled out the cheesecake, so I'm very sorry. You weren't really missing anything. It actually, I don't know if the water bath wasn't high enough, but it cracked in the middle, so she was kind of ugly anyway. But I mean, cheesecake is cheesecake and it's still delicious. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next week. Bye.